Last week I said we were going to go through the last three of these illustrations in Jesus' illustration that he's doing. How many of you believe me when I said that? I said, it ain't going to happen. Y'all are right. You just know, we might get through one. That's right. We'll probably not even get through one adequately. But you know what helped me make up my mind? I believe it was second service. I don't know. And so if you're in here, come up and see me, because they didn't come up after second service. But a lady came up to me between the services, and she just looked, and I didn't understand exactly what she meant at first. But she said, thank you for remaining. And I thought, remaining? Remaining what? Remaining calm in the face of a storm? Remaining, what is it? And she goes, for just remaining where the Spirit leads you. She said, for not feeling like you have to constantly get to the next verse because we're running out of this or running out of that. And she said, I have loved just going slow and meditating and thinking about the things that we've talked about on Sunday. So she just took my hand and said, thank you for remaining. So in the spirit of that good lady, we're remaining this morning. That's what we're going to do. And that sounded so much spiritual than what I called it. And so anyway, we're in the Sermon on the Mount. If you've been with us for a while, you know that we've been in it for a while. It's found in its entirety in the book of Matthew, but get this, Mark, Luke, and John also tell us about it. And the particular passage that we're going to be looking at today, which is Matthew 5, verses 33 through 38, in that particular passage, James, the half-brother of Jesus, quotes it almost verbatim in his book. Now, where do you think James heard that? No doubt James is kind of sitting in the audience that day. You know, at the time Jesus is preaching, early on in his ministry, the brothers and sisters of Jesus, they didn't believe him either. But all of a sudden, there had to be something special about Jesus that by the time Jesus is resurrected back into heaven, his half-brother believes that he's the Son of God. What would it take for you to convince your half-brother that you were the Son of God? Must have been a lot of stuff going on because James has become a believer. And James writes these very words. And the reason Matthew and Mark and Luke and John record these words, and the reason James tell these words again, is because this sermon is the foundation piece of not just everything Jesus will teach, but everything Jesus will do. Every move, every word, every thought has its foundation in this sermon. We've kind of rebranded it. I thank the tech team, Corey and all his people for coming up with this upside-down kingdom, because it really is an upside-down kingdom. When you compare the kingdom that Jesus is bringing into the world, which is exactly what Matthew chapter 4 says, that Jesus went about all their areas teaching and preaching in the synagogues. And what he was teaching and preaching was this, that there was the good news that there was a kingdom of God, and you could be a part of that kingdom. And it wasn't a kingdom like any other. And when you compare that kingdom to the kingdoms of the world, well, it really looked upside down. For the kingdom that Jesus taught about was a kingdom where the first would be last and the last would be first. It's a kingdom where the greatest of all would be the servant of all, but all of a sudden the servant of all would rise to the ranks of greatest of all. A kingdom where the king would give his life for the citizens of his kingdom. So what is this crazy upside down kingdom that Jesus is preaching? What does it look like? Well, that is the Sermon on the Mount. We're in Matthew chapter 5, where Jesus makes a statement in verse 20 that has really been the jumping off stage for every place that we have been in Matthew chapter 5. We're going to bring it up one more time because it was a statement that would have puzzled everyone in his audience in that day. He says, for I tell you, and then again, the you would have been specifically the followers of Jesus that day. And even though there were more people than that in his audience, there were people who were just curious. There were people who had come to be healed, and there were those religious leaders, the Pharisees, the teachers in the law, who were in the audience. But this message was specifically, in these 6 illustrations, specifically targeted for those people who were claiming to be followers, claiming to be disciples of Jesus. And he tells them something that would have both shocked them and shocked the people that the statement was not directed to, which was the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. For I tell you that unless your righteousness exceeds, goes beyond the righteousness of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, well, you can certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. And as I've said several times already, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law would have been thinking, nobody could be as righteous as us. What does he mean by that? And the people who were the common person, the common man and woman or student in the audience that day would have been thinking, how could we ever be as righteous as those people? So Jesus begins in Matthew chapter 5 to give 6 illustrations of what he means by this one verse. divorce. And as you read these illustrations, I want you to know they're not just random things that Jesus would have pulled out of his hat. They are things that were common, things that were going on among the religious people, the teachings of the religious people of his day, and those people who were learning, trying to figure out, well, what are they saying? Well, illustration number one, if you remember, was murder. And he takes murder and he says, it's not just about a physical act that you might do with your hands. You can murder with your words just as much. Illustration number two was an adultery. It's not just an act you do in a bed with someone you're not married to. It's those longing, lustful looks that keep on looking. Illustration three that we covered last week was divorce. Jesus says your focus is to find legal loopholes to get out of your marriage, when what I intended all along was for your focus to find ways to make your marriage what God intended it to be. And now he comes to his fourth illustration, taking oaths. Now, outside a court of law, we don't really see that a lot today, practiced widely. And I want you to know, I may talk a little bit about it next week, it depends, but I want you to know, Jesus is not really addressing what happens when you go into a court of law and you take an oath that you say or that you swear you're going to tell the truth. It's not really what's addressed here, and I may address that a little bit more next week. If you want me to, write it on a connection card. If not, we'll move on. But hey, I want you to know, if you've been in a court of law and they ask you to do that, I don't think there's anything in Jesus' teaching that prohibits us from saying, hey, I'll tell the truth, because that's what we are. We're people. They're people of our word. We're people of the truth, which is really the principle of the law. And when you hear the words taking oaths, I want you to hear two things. Two other words, vows and promises. They're used interchangeably throughout Scripture, and in the book of Matthew, they're even used interchangeably. Sometimes he'll say the word vow. Sometimes he'll say the word oath. Some people, some versions, if you get the Good News Translation or the New Living Translation, it will also call it a promise. So, with all those in mind, what I want to do is read the actual words of Jesus from Matthew chapter 5 that he gave to the people that day, and then we'll go back and unpack what it says to us. So, beginning in verse 33, again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago. So he's talking, all of a sudden, this is not the law of Moses that he's quoting, it's what they've heard. You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made. But I tell you, now, getting into what he's saying, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond that, well, it comes from the evil one. Now, I want to focus on those verses. We're going to rewind, we're going to look at them, and we're going to look at them under the lens that we introduced to you last week with illustration number 3. That lens contained 3 questions. The 3 questions were this: what did the law of Moses say about taking oaths or making oaths and vows or promises? Number 2, what were the religious leaders of Jesus' day teaching? That is the you have heard it has been said part. And then number 3, what did Jesus say? That is the but I say to you part. So with those 3 things in mind, what I'd like to do is rewind, go back to verse 33, and let's take it apart verse by verse. Again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the oaths or the vows that you have made. First, it would be good to know that that statement as it exists is not an accurate representation of exactly what the law of Moses said, which is why Jesus begins, you have heard it has been said. And here's where it gets a little bit of sticky. While this quote as is isn't found in the law of Moses, bits and pieces of it are. Have you ever known people who could take bits and pieces of verses or bits and pieces of anything, any speech, and then put it together and come up with something that really wasn't intended? Well, that, if you can imagine, that's what's happened here. They have taken several verses from the old law and they put something together. Since the fall of man in the garden, I think we have this sin nature in us. It's kind of what the Old Testament writer alludes to, that there is something in us since the fall that just wants to do something that's not right. Anyone here who has a child or knows a child or has seen a child, you know something, don't you? You know that no one had to teach your 2-year-old to forcibly say, that's mine. I want that, and I'm taking that from you. It just comes naturally. The inclination to get ahead, the inclination to be dishonest, particularly when it's not in your best interest. Very early on, a child, and I will not speak from personal experience, but may I say, a child knows the price to pay when you ask them a question: did you throw your sister's ice cream on the ground? And just by the tone of father's voice, child number one is inclined to do what? Lie. You got it right. Because he knows that there could be bodily harm should he admit the truth and go for it. It happened from the very beginning. I mean, we get it naturally after this natural inclination to sin. You have heard what I think is the best vocalist band praise team in the world. So, you're about to go down here because I'm going to tell you a little song that I learned when I lived in Hawaii. It was called "Them Bones Gonna Rise Again." It's all about the story of Adam and Eve. And in the song, it goes through the Adam and Eve being in the garden and Satan coming in, and it says something like, the serpent coiled around the trunk, da 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 da, and that Miss Eve is all he want, da 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 da. So she took a pig and she took a pull, da 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 da. Then Eve took a big mouthful. Then it says this. Next thing, the Lord came walking around. Do-do-do-do-do-do. Saw the peelings all over the ground. Do-do-do-do-do-do. Is them your peelings you did leave? Do-do-do-do-do-do. Here it comes. Not me, Lord. Must have been Eve. From the very beginning of time, we have been conditioned to say, it wasn't me. So God comes to Adam in the garden and says, well, what about it, Adam? I'm holding you. I'm asking you what's going on. And he's like, not me. I think it was Eve. What about it, Eve? What's going on? Not me. I think it was the devil. We have been conditioned to be people who are, dishonest. Today, if you want to buy a house, if you want to buy a car, I'm just going to go ahead and apologize in advance if there are any auto dealers or car salesmen in the house. The words of the preacher may or may not be the representation of the owners of this place, but anyway, you cannot, in any car dealership that I know, walk into the car dealership and say, hey, I like that car. I want to get that car. Hey, I promise to pay. Let's shake hands, bud. They are not going to do that and then just come out and say, well, hey, here are the keys. Okie dokie, everything's okay. You just go on with a promise to pay and we're good. Drive away. Doesn't work that way. Why doesn't it work that way? No, they're not going to tell you this, but I'll tell you because I'm speaking the truth. They don't trust you. They don't trust you. And don't take it personally. It's not just you. It's us, collectively. And it doesn't matter whether you're buying a house or whether you're buying a car. Every single contract you sign is based on a premise of what? Somebody's going to cheat somebody out of something. So we better put it on the dotted line so I can get back. And really, even the whole process begins with a little white lie, because they're going to look at you and they're going to say, well, we just need a little bit of information. And then they're going to put a 76-page document in front of you. And they're going to say, what's your name? Social security number? What's your driver's license? Here, Agnes, I want a copy of the front and the back. Where do you work? Did you work there a year ago? What about 5 years ago? Did you work there? 10 years ago, where did you work? Where do you live? How long have you lived there? Do you rent? Do you own? Do you lease? How much do you make? Do you have any other income that we might could attach if you fell on this loan? Oh, I didn't say that. Do you have any other income that might help meet your financial obligations should you lose that fine job that you have? Who's your mama? Where does mama live? Where does mama work? Who's your closest living relative not living with you that has a good job? In case we need to attach something. What is said relative's address? Could you give us said relative's phone number? What is your relationship to said relative? And then you know what they do? They look at you and they smile and say, thank you for filling out our 76-page document. You can sit right there and relax in that chair, or you may go to our lounge and have some water peanuts, and if nobody's eating it, the last nature bar from Kroger is sitting in the lounge waiting on you. because I'm going to step over here and make a call because at its heart, I don't believe a word you said, so I'm calling the credit bureau. I mean, we're conditioned from the very beginning not to touch each other. And to be fair, we don't really trust them, do you? I asked second service, and I was surprised the number of heads that went up. If you go into a contract, and let's just say on a thing you drive, so I don't have to say what it is, how many of you go in thinking they're going to try to cheat me in some way? All right, how many? Look, I mean, it's just out there. That's just kind of what we do. It's the American spirit of how things get around. And based on my extensive knowledge of the law, coupled with my law degree from the prestigious school of Judge Judith Chineland, I have learned that there is a principle of law called puffing. Puffing. Have you ever heard of puffing? Well, if you look it up in the dictionary, the first definition is this. Sorry. But that is not the definition we're talking about today. The legal definition of puffing is this: to convey an overstated belief. Just say it. To lie. To convey an overstated belief about some good or service to a prospective buyer with the goal of making a sale of that good or service. Or, according to Legal Terms for Dummies, which I own a copy of now, in legalese, puffery refers to an expression of opinion by a seller that isn't made as a representation of fact. It is an exaggeration about a product's quality that isn't a legally enforceable promise. You buy this 57 Chevy that has sat in my grandmama's yard for the last 36 years, covered by a tarp that has rotted. It will take you to California and back. And nobody cares because it's puffing. It's puffing. And I use that crazy illustration to say, if we've not been conditioned to outright lie, we have certainly in our society been conditioned to puff. And while all of that is funny, what it really does in the end, it weakens the word truth. Truth. There's a point in the life of Jesus. It's going to come about 3 years from the date that Jesus is telling us this sermon. And it's the trial that Jesus will stand accused of. And everything that they throw against Jesus will be a lie. The whole trial will be based on lies. And not lies from unbelievers, lies from the religious leaders. He'll be arrested. He will stand before the religious leaders of his day, some of whom no doubt are in his audience on this day listening to him say the words he said. They're going to hit him. They're going to blindfold him and they're going to say, prophesy who it is that hit you. They're going to spit on him. They're going to pull out his beard, Luke says. And while all of this is going on in the house or the courtyard of Caiaphas and Annas, the high priest, Peter is on the outside denying, might I say, lying. Because at this point it's convenient to just say, I really don't know the guy on the inside. The Jewish leaders will bring Jesus to the Roman governor Pilate, and they'll say, he's a criminal, Pilate, punish him. Pilate will look back to the Jewish officials and say, you have authority to punish him yourself if you want to punish him. They will look back to Pilate and say, you're right that we have the ability to punish. We don't have the ability to execute, and we want him dead. So you take him, Pilate. That's what we want. So Pilate will ask Jesus to come into the courtyard or wherever he is. They'll take him from there, and they'll go into the house where they're at. And one of the questions Pilate will ask Jesus is this: are you a king? You, the one who just 3 years ago went out through the countryside of Judea proclaiming the good news of this kingdom that you can be a part of. Are you a king? To which Jesus will look back to Pilate and say, well, you say that I am a king. For this reason, for this cause, for this purpose, I came into the world to bear witness of the truth. The truth. And in a moment where eternity stood between heaven and earth, Pilate will look to Jesus and ask the question, what is truth? What is truth? In a world where dishonesty and deception seem to be the norm and even accepted, in a world where little white lies start early in little human beings and extend to the front pages of the most famous people in the world, maybe Pilate's question is still worth asking. Because at the heart of Matthew chapter 5, verses 33 through 37 is the question, what is truth? So to answer what's going on in the days of Jesus, let's back up to question number 1. Well, what did the law say? What did the law of Moses say about making an oath, about keeping your promises or your vows? Well, first of all, kind of like last week with divorce, it doesn't say a whole lot. The first overriding principle about making an oath or taking a vow from the Old Testament of the law of Moses came from commandment number 9, which, does anybody remember what that is? I'll put it on the screen. Don't lie. Don't lie. Exodus 20:16. If you grew up in church or if you've heard of the 10 Commandments, you probably heard it stated like this: you shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. So that was the overriding principle about making an oath or keeping an oath in the Old Testament. If you back up, one of the other commandments from that they had pieced together with this commandment was one of the others. It was Exodus 20, verse 7. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. So over time, what had happened is that kind of a theory had developed that as long as you didn't invoke the name of God in your vow, then it was okay. They took those two and they pieced them together to get you have heard what Jesus said. But they didn't stop there. In the law, Leviticus 19, verse 12 said this: do not swear. Now there's our word oath, same word, vow, same word, promise. Do not swear falsely by my name and so profane the name of the Lord your God. And then Deuteronomy 23, verse 21. Notice that word, if you make a vow to the Lord your God, do not be slow to repay it. And I would encourage you to go on and read. It's kind of funny, but I ran out of room down here. The last part of that says, because if you make a vow to God, he's going to come looking for it. Read it in all the modern translations. It's kind of good. If you make a vow to God, you better keep it, because God's going to come knocking at your door if you don't pay it. But anyway, that's just a whole other thing. Be careful who you say something to. What I want you to notice through all of those and under the law of Moses is this: there was no actual law that said to make an oath or not to make an oath. It really wasn't in there. There were two guiding principles about the truth or about oaths, vows, and promises that the law of Moses spoke to. Number 1 was this: don't lie. Commandment number 9, don't lie. Principle number 2 is this: if you do make an oath, they're not commanded to make an oath. If you make an oath, keep it. Keep it. Those were the two overriding principles from the Old Testament about making oaths. So if that's really all the Old Testament said about making oaths, it brings us to our second question. Well, what were the religious leaders of Jesus' day teaching about that? So by the time you get to the days of Jesus, what we see happening is the religious guys are shifting the conversation away from the oath that a person might take, the oath to marry somebody and you take a vow, the oath to follow God the rest of your life, whatever the oath may be. It had shifted from the context of the oath to the words you would say to make the oath. And all of a sudden, things had come very legalistic, where they would say, well, you can use certain words, and if you use certain words, then your oath will be binding. And if you don't use those words, well, then you can kind of get out of the oath or the covenant or the promise, the contract, whatever it is that you want to say. In other words, for them, there was the vow, and then there were the words you used to make the vow. And what they had begun to teach is that the words you use to make your promises are more important than the promise that you made on this end. Can you begin to see the problem? And keep in mind, neither the oath nor the words used to make the oath were commanded in the law or the focus of the law. The focus of the law of Moses was what? Number 1, don't lie. Number 2, if you give your word, keep your word. That was really it. Be a man and a woman of your words. And just like the religious leaders of Jesus' day were focusing on all the legal ways to get out of their marriages, they were also focusing on all the legal ways to get out of a promise you had made. Do you think it doesn't apply in the business world today? I bet you every contract that's presented in a business, somebody has tried to think of a way that you can get out of keeping your word. You see, the people of today are really no different from the people back then. They're focusing on all these things, and that's at the heart of the world that Jesus enters in. And what they're doing is really saying this. Well, when we make a statement, if we want the statement to seem more important, we'll say things like, well, I swear by Jehovah, or I swear by Yahweh, or I swear by the temple, or I swear by the gold that's in the temple, I swear by the altar, I swear by the gift that is on the altar. They would say things like that. It's not far from really what I've heard people today. Have you ever heard somebody, well, I swear this, or I swear, I've heard people say, I swear to God. I swear, And isn't it funny, when people swear, they always swear on something bigger than themselves, or something they feel is bigger than themselves. Nobody swears on a mosquito. Nobody says, well, I swear on my second cousin twice removed on my mother's side. Nobody swears that. I mean, if you're going to swear on something, it's going to be your mama or your mama's grave, or it's going to be the Bible. I mean, when we swear, we use something big to swear by, because there's this kind of feeling that if it's bigger, if it's better, if it's, then somehow the validity of my word is a little bit stronger. Well, if I swear on this, you can believe me now. So they had taken a principle of the law of Moses that said, just keep your word. If you say it, mean it. And over time, they had taken what Moses said about vows, and now they were saying, well, you really only have to keep it if you invoke the name of God. That's where they took that other commandment. Do not misuse the name of the Lord. Do not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Well, as long as you don't invoke the name of God in your vows, well, then you can break your vow. They said, well, actually, keeping your vow is only important, their word, according to Josephus, if you have used the divine name of God. Otherwise, your word is not really binding. Which leads us to number 3. Well, what did Jesus have to say about all of that? So he arrives on the scene. What does he say? Well, as Yoda might say, pleased he was not. In fact, of all the things that we look at in there, it almost, when I first started thinking about this, and really a couple of weeks ago, it's kind of on my mind, but I had murder, adultery, and divorce on there, which is 3 things every preacher loves to talk about that. And so I had all that on my mind, so I was thinking, well, it's not really a lot there. We'll just skim right through that and get over it, which led me to make a statement last week that wasn't true. I think we'll cover all 3 in 1 week. Because you look at that and you think, oh, well, we don't really, outside a court of law, you don't really hear that language a whole lot today. Maybe I got this one covered. Well, as I began to dive in, I thought, not as much as I thought. You see, Matthew chapter 5 is the initial conversation of Jesus beginning the conversation on the subject of taking oaths. If you fast forward 3 years to the end of his life on this earth, when he is teaching some of his final things to the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, what you find is the warning that he gave in Matthew chapter 5 has become a woe to you in Matthew chapter 23. And by the time you get to Matthew chapter 23, what we'll see in Jesus' words are not only the you have said part, but the but I say to you part as well. And you begin to figure out what's happening in the days of Jesus by the language and the accusation he makes against the religious leaders. So hold on, it's going to get rough for a minute. Matthew 23, starting in verse 16. Jesus says, woe to you blind guides. You religious leaders are supposed to be guiding the people. You're blind yourself. You say, if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing. But anyone who swears by the gold that's in the temple, well, he's bound by that oath. Which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? Do you understand his question? Jesus' question is this: does the gold in the temple carry more weight than the temple itself? Maybe if I made it about today and about, myself. What if I were to look and say, oh, I swear by the NorthField building. And if I swear by the NorthField building, it really doesn't matter. But if I swear by the carpet in the NorthField building, then I got to keep my words. Well, this is not in the real Bible. I have a version of the Bible of my own. It is called the Tom Simplified Version, STV. I think what Jesus said was this in verse 17. You guys are nuts. And you were supposed to be the leaders. How can this happen? Well, we go on with it a little. Jesus wasn't finished. And I want you to notice, even though we're on point 3, what did Jesus say about this? In discovering what Jesus said about this, you find out what they were doing in his day. He continues in verse 18 of the real version. You also say, if anyone swears by the altar, well, it means nothing. But anyone who swears by the gift on the altar is bound by that oath. You bind men. Which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? Listen to that same wording from the Message version of Scripture. You're hopeless. You say, if somebody makes a promise and crosses his finger, well, then that's nothing. But if he swears with his hand on the Bible, well, then that's everything. How ignorant. Does the leather on the Bible carry more weight than the skin on your hand? And what about this? If you shake hands on a promise, you say, well, you can ignore it. But if you raise your hand and say, God is my witness, well, that's serious. How ridiculous. Well, then we get to verse 20, where Jesus comes to the end, the "but I say to you" part at the end of his life. He says, therefore. Anytime you hear the word therefore, you should ask yourself a question. What is what he's going to say next? Therefore. Well, it's there for us to know this is Jesus' teaching now. Anyone who swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it. And anyone who swears by the temple swears by it and by the one who dwells in it. And anyone who swears by heaven swears by God's throne and by the one who sits on it. That's what Jesus said about oath keeping 3 years after this Sermon on the Mount he's preaching. So let's go back and look then at what he said on the Sermon on the Mount that should have served as a warning to what was happening in the Pharisees. If you go back to Matthew chapter 5, verse 34, Jesus says, "But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by earth, for it is his footstool, nor by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black." All of this going on, Jesus takes us all the way back to what he meant when he gave Moses the law. And while taking oaths, again, as I said, is not really something that we see an awful lot of in our country right now, outside of a court of law. Well, keeping our word is a big thing, isn't it? Contracts, they're a big thing. But if you were wander around the streets of Judea in the days of Jesus, it would be common for someone to hear someone say, "Well, I make an oath on my head," or "I make an oath by the temple," or "I swear by Jehovah," or "I swear by the temple that Jehovah lives in." I bet some of you might remember as a child making a promise and then someone else looking at you and saying what? "Cross your heart, hope to die, stick a needle in your eye," I hope, not mine. You see, by the days of Jesus, the focus was no longer on being a person of the word. The focus had shifted to how can I word my stuff in such a way that I always have an out. And Jesus said, you need to know something. That's not a kingdom person. Kingdom people are people of their word. Well, Jesus' point is this. You think that because you don't utter the name of God, that you can keep God out of the words that you use? Jesus would say, I tell you, you cannot keep God out of any promise you make. Because if you swear by heaven, do you think God's not in that? It's his throne, man. It's where he lives. It's where he reigns. Do you think that if you swear by the earth, well, it means nothing and you can do whatever you want to, that you left God out? Do you not realize he created it? That he was the one to look at the oceans and say, this far you can go and no further. Do you think that if you say, oh, I swear by Jerusalem, you think you can leave God out because you choose a city? Do you realize you happen to choose a city? That a king that you remember, a king that you long for, a king that you would hope would return today and make it just like it was, a king that was meant to point you to King Jesus, came from that city. So you think if you swear by that city, you can leave God out of it? You cannot keep God out of a single promise, vow, or oath you make. Even if you make that oath about you yourself. Do you realize that? There is not a part of you that Jesus didn't create. You don't believe that? Jesus would say, then on your own will that one hair on your head be a different color than what it is. You think you have power? Do you think you know what your Heavenly Father wants? On your own, you can't make a single hair white or black. So why do you swear by that? Everything you see, Everything you touch, everything you are, from the next breath you take to the color of the hair that will be lost in your brush today, all came from me. And when you speak, you make me a partner in every word you use. So I say, be a person who doesn't have to swear at all. And I will not take away from the law of Moses. I will point you back to the law of Moses, and I will say, don't lie. And if you make a promise, keep it. Anything other than that comes from the evil one. Verse 37, all you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond that comes from the evil one. Do you know why he says anything beyond that comes from the evil one? Because the question that Pilate asked, what is truth? Pilate had no idea that truth that day was standing 24 inches from where Pilate stood. In John 14, the very best friend of Jesus would pen words that Jesus himself wrote. I am the way, and I am what? The truth. In the book of Matthew alone, 57 times Jesus will say, I tell you the truth. In the book of John, 51 times Jesus will say, I tell you the truth. And what you and I have to understand is this. It wasn't just that Jesus spoke the truth. He was the truth personified in a man. And he would say, over here is a kingdom. It's the kingdom of darkness. It's the kingdom of lies. And when you avoid the truth, well, you point people to that kingdom. My kingdom. Well, it's a kingdom ruled by the truth itself, where I not only keep my word, I am that truth. And what Jesus would teach throughout his ministry is that honest people, they don't even have to resort to an oath. They, like their leader, always speak words of truth. Because being the light of this world, and being the salt of this earth, well, it's so much more than not physically murdering the person beside you. It's those angry words that kill and destroy. Being the light of this world and the salt of this earth is so much more than not hopping in bed with the person you're not married to. It's what you watch when no one's watching. Kingdom people. Those people don't look for loopholes to get a divorce. Those people look for ways to commit to what God intended. They fight for their marriage. And kingdom people, well, they don't look for ways to avoid keeping their promises. Their word is truth. You can count on it. You can take it to the bank. And just like you can count on their Savior, you can count on them, because they follow a man who said, I am the way, I am the truth, and I am the life. And that's where we'll pick up next week, in this crazy, upside-down kingdom that Jesus invites each of us to be a part of. Father, I thank you for both challenging and convicting words, Father, that we aspire to, but, Father, words that are hard to live up to. I thank you that we can take something as old as the ancient scripture itself and see how really it applies to us today. I thank you for the grace that you give us when we fail, and I thank you for the strength that you have put within us to be people of our word. People that when other people see us, they say, you can count on what they say, because they follow a Jesus, they follow a Savior that you can count on as well. May we be people of our word. And the whole church at NorthField said,